Hello, and welcome to How to Build a Fast and Secure Mobile App Development Strategy. Our webinar will go through building a mobile application with the FMX or FireMonkey framework and some of the strategies used to develop these applications. Your presenters today are Al Manarino, Craig Chapman, Jim McKeith, and myself, Mary Kelly. You can reach out to any of us for questions or comments at our first.lastname@embarcadero.com. We have a lot to cover today from each of our presenters. We will quickly talk some mobile app strategy and architecture specs before showing you a complete FMX cross-platform application using templated forms, interfacing with data, embedding InterBase, and building an HTML report with embedded images to round out our application. With the number of mobile users in the world reaching billions, the need to have applications available at the touch of your fingers has grown. There are more mobile users than desktop users, and these mobile users spend a large amount of their time on mobile apps, whether they be gaming, social media, or business applications. We all want information at the touch of a button as quickly as we can. You unlock your phone, tap on an app, and you're ready to go. Instant access. The ability to work offline is one of the biggest differences between apps and websites. You need an active connection to perform critical tasks like purchases, but basic functionality and content can still work when you're in offline mode. Applications running on mobile devices have an added bonus of using sensors already built in. Taking a picture with the camera that scans PDFs, barcodes, you've got GPS and fingerprint scanners. Mobile applications can load faster than mobile sites in many instances and expand your capabilities by connecting to IoT devices and other cloud services. Each operating system has its nuances, whether you're working with Android or iOS. When you're developing a mobile application, you need to know the background of your operating system. You have to know how or where your application will run. You have to get all the information relating to multiple devices running different operating systems and versions, what each new feature is that comes out with every release, how the background services work, the life cycle, device settings and performance, and respective UI objects. A great application is easy and simple to use, with less of a learning curve to give your users a great experience. This is building a good UI UX design for your application. Simple, clear, concise, yet interesting. The architecture behind your application plays just as important a role when in the design stage. You want to build an application with a solid yet adaptable architecture that best suits your customer's target needs. Yet another challenge is dealing with devices and screen sizes that your application fits to. If you design an app that only runs on a few select screens and devices, then you really limit your user base and your user's experience. And yet, one of the biggest challenges or concerns for mobile developers is security. Each platform has guidelines that must be followed for applications to be released on the respective Apple or Play stores. Maintaining security measures such as securing any data on the device while in use and at rest can be a daunting task when you think of how many devices and applications you have out there. There are several ways in which using RAD Studio, Delphi, or C++ Builder can help you to develop mobile applications that overcome some of the challenges. With the FireMonkey Visual Component Library, or FMX library, you get flexible designers, styling for each platform and platform components. You write your UI once, customize everything at the design time, and deploy to your target platforms. You also get the cross-platform runtime library and FireDAC database access. You get native platform compilers for 5 operating systems, 32 and 64-bit CPUs, Intel and ARM, to maximize your app performance. Using rapid application development, you can reduce your development time and easily move from prototyping to production and get customers the updates that they're looking for. With Delphi, you can have built-in components to increase quality and functionality with user interface components, database connectivity, and to extend and customize your application with your users in mind. We also have a multi-device form designer that gives you a master form where you can then create specific views that maximize your device's UI, UX, and so much more. The application that we're going to show you today incorporates a few considerations that can help you gear up your mobile application development. This application uses device cameras to take pictures and get device sensor data and services to log entries that are stored in an InterBase database on your local device that can later be exported as JSON or HTML. So I'll pass the mic off to Craig, who will go ahead and show you our application.
Okay, so here we are in the data logging app, and this is the first screen that you'll be brought to after you first sign in. And we're effectively looking at the project screen, which is going to list all of the projects that are stored in the database. Now, there are 2 different pieces of data that will be stored in our database. The projects is the master level, so this is going to be a list of projects with a title and a description. And then there are log entries, which is a detail level, a detail of the project. So each project will have 0 or more log entries in the database. And so we're going to take a look at each of these data types, how we enter them into the system, and then we'll go and take a look at how the code functions behind that. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a project. So I'm going to click this little addition button here, and I need to give the project a title and a description. Well, this is going to be Craig's Amazing Project. And I'll just put this project is amazing for the description. So when I go ahead and click on done, that's going to insert that entry into our database. And it brings us back to the edit page where if I want to, I can change something about this. So I'm going to change the period to an exclamation there. And this change will be saved when my cursor, my caret here, leaves this control. So if I close the app, or if I hit the back button here or click into another edit, that's when the save is going to happen. I'm going to back out to the first page so that we can see that our project has appeared in the projects list. And then when I come back in, we can see that the exclamation has been retained. So that means that it's been added to the database. And the second type of data, as I said, is log entries. So I'm going to add a new log entry. This is going to launch my camera. Okay, so there's a picture of me. And that picture has been stored into our database as a log entry. Now, the only pieces of data that are currently being stored in the database for each log entry are the image that we've taken here and the latitude and longitude read from a position sensor. Because I'm running this application on Windows, I don't have a sensor to pick up the lat and long, which is why this has introduced 0. But if I were running this on a mobile device, this additional location information here would be looked up from my latitude and longitude. So it's not stored in the database, it's going to be looked up each time we inspect a log entry. And so if I back up here to the amazing project, you can see the first log entry here has been added as a date timestamp. And of course I can delete these entries as well. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's delete this log entry. Just hit the delete button there and the log entry is gone. And similarly, I can delete the project entry as well. So we come back to projects and that is gone.
Now we'll hand things over to Al and he'll walk us through some of the code and talk about building user interfaces.
With many companies taking the mobile-first approach, building applications that work on multiple platforms is a requirement for success. Application users have become accustomed to stunning user interfaces and intuitive user experiences. Normally, mobile app development requires learning multiple programming languages and tools like iOS's Xcode or Android's Android Studio, and then replicating the same functionality for each platform's display and unique UI requirements. But with FireMonkey, there's a better way. FireMonkey, also known as FMX, is the multi-device application framework behind RAD Studio, Delphi, and/or C++ Builder. FMX is designed for teams building native apps for Windows, Mac OS X desktop, iOS, and Android, and getting the applications to the app stores and enterprises fast. With RAD Studio, Delphi, and/or C++ Builder, we provide a full application stack providing user interface, database, networking, inter-device communication, and other libraries across all platforms. As we see here in the IDE, one of the single most important concepts to understand in RAD Studio, Delphi, and/or C++ Builder cross-platform development is the concept of styles. Styling is the cornerstone of the cross-platform FireMonkey architecture. Now, styles are used at different levels. There are platform-specific styles for Android, iOS, Mac OS X, and Windows. You have built-in styles that you use when you create a new multi-device project, so File, New, Multi-Device Application, and you can switch between styles in the Form Designer, so you can go from Windows, Mac OS X, iOS, and Android right inside the Form Designer, have a preview of what the application would look like at runtime. The FireMonkey controls on a form have a style lookup property. So for example, if I select this button on the form, we see it has a style lookup property that allows me to change it from a drawer tool button to a compose tool button or a delete item button or any specific style for this given Android component. And likewise, if I change the style from Android to iOS and I select the same button and we look at its style lookup properties, we now see iOS specific styles I can select for this button. So instead of having it as a iOS drawer tool button, I could select the iOS delete item button or the iOS compose tool button. You can also apply a custom style using the tStylebook component. So here for this application, we applied the Sterling style to the application, but using the Style Designer, you can easily add one of the many included styles to your application, like we see here. And finally, with the built-in style editor that you can access from Tools, Bitmap Style Designer, you can visually customize a given style item in the style book as easily as you would customize a component on the form. So the key point with FireMonkey styles is you can build stunning graphical user interfaces, all from the same user interface that will support Windows, Mac OS X, iOS, and Android. To help us get started with our FireMonkey cross-platform user interfaces, we will use two of the included FireMonkey GUI templates, one called the home screen and the other one called the login screen. Now these FireMonkey GUI templates are a set of UI template projects for FireMonkey that are included in Embarcadero, RAD Studio, Delphi, and/or C++ Builder that are available via the Embarcadero Get It package manager. As I just mentioned, you can access these FireMonkey GUI templates from the IDE using Tools, Get It package manager under the category of Sample Projects. And here you will see 6 sets of templates where each set demonstrates a different type of user interface and 3 examples in each set for a total of 18 user interfaces you can start with to create your stunning user interfaces. For this FireMonkey field logger application we created here, we use the home screen, and we also use the the login screen that we installed into our IDE. So we started to build this field logger application by installing the Delphi home screen and the login screen applications in the IDE. This is what the FireMonkey GUI template for the home screen looks like, and this is what the FireMonkey GUI template for the login screen looks like. So these FireMonkey GUI templates serve as a great starting point for developers looking to build stunning cross-platform user interfaces, and they can easily be customized by changing the images, the icons, the styles, and much more. These different FireMonkey GUI templates demonstrate responsive design in a variety of layout styles, which makes it easy to design and customize your applications visually at design time. Next, let's discuss a few ways of doing application navigation between the forms for multi-device mobile applications. So you have a few navigation techniques between the forms, such as tabbed forms with navigation using the T-tab control component, and or navigating between forms by calling the form's show method. So for our application, the main form, which is our home screen form, is displayed at application startup, and its lifetime is the same as the application. So now we can implement the functionality to navigate between the home screen form and the login form. So in the main form, the home screen form, when we click on the login button, we want to call the show method of the login form. So we can do that by using the onClick event of the login button on the home screen form. So first we're going to hide the home screen form, and then we are going to show the login screen form. We can quickly test the application navigation between forms by running the application here as a Windows 32-bit application. So at startup, we have our home screen, and when we click on the login button, we do see it navigates to the login screen form, so all of that works just fine. Next, let's talk about application security. Application security isn't a feature or a benefit, it's a bare necessity. One breach in security could cost your company not just millions of dollars, but a lifetime of trust. That is why security needs to be a priority from the moment you start writing the first line of code. For our application security for login authentication, we can use the strong password protection provided by our embedded InterBase database. InterBase's password protection supports a password length of 32 bytes and a password algorithm using a modern cryptographic hash function that is more widely accepted by organizations in private industry and government. The InterBase password design uses SHA-1, which generates a fixed length 160-bit hash. This all means we have additional functionality using the embedded InterBase database for supporting a longer effective password length that results in stronger password protection. Now that we have our login form displayed, we need to enter the username and password for our InterBase IBLite database to log in, authenticate our application. For our InterBase IBLite database, we created users that either belong to the role of staff or to the role of manager. This way we have role-based security on our application. Based on who you log in as, controls what features you can access. On the login screen, we enter the username and password, and then to authenticate against the username and password for the InterBase database, we can use this code on this slide for the onClick event of the sign-in button. Next, let's discuss our strategy of using a data model. Here we created a project types unit where we can add data types for the projects table that are shared between the user interface and the data access module. This gives us a level of separation between the user interface and the data access logic. We will define an interface for communication between the two tiers of the application. The data module will implement it, and our data capture forms of the application will use this interface as the only way to communicate with the data module. This gives us a pluggable architecture. This way, our user interface can be developed independently, and we can provide different implementations of data access logic without affecting the rest of the application. This way, our application could be using different types of embedded databases, a different data access framework, or maybe we would want later to switch to storing our data in a plain file or in cloud storage. So here on our data model, we also implemented a generic list of project items. This will be useful to return the list of all project items from the data module. Now that we have our data model defined, the next step is to define the standard operations that the data module should provide. Now these would be the CRUD operations of create, read, update, delete, and list. And these operations should be implemented by 5 different methods. So here we have declared a new interface type called iProjectsData that will define what functionality our data module should offer. Now later in this webinar, Craig Chapman will show us how the interface was implemented, allowing the application to bridge the gap between the user interface and the data. Now let me turn this webinar over to Mary Kelly, who will walk us through how to embed the InterBase database into our FireMonkey multi-device application.
A quick overview of what InterBase really is and does is that it's a small yet powerful embeddable database. The overall footprint is tiny. The simple installation and deployment, the near zero administration, because InterBase is used in several distributed applications, being able to just deploy it and leave it alone without having to worry about someone monitoring it on the back end and managing it, makes it very cost effective. From a security standpoint, you also have transparent encryption, meaning that the data is encrypted at rest with full database, table, and column level encryption, meaning that your data is safe and secure, and that's extremely important. The InterBase to Go database engine can be embedded in applications by directly using the InterBase database engine library. It doesn't have to be installed on any server or any end user workstation, and it doesn't require that InterBase be installed on a machine before you use it. Since To Go has no separate database server process running, and the database engine executes in the actual application process space, the embedded InterBase engine runs faster with these types of database applications because network connections aren't used and the data is not being passed between the application and a separate database server. This gives application developers more choice and flexibility in the database design and deployment. Such examples for embedded services would be small devices like IoT or public kiosks. Now, included in your Delphi installation is an IBLite database registration text file. This text file will be used to activate your InterBase licenses on your mobile devices. Now you're going to want to toggle to the catalog repository InterBase Redist folder and unzip that folder to your InterBase installation directory. Keeping this file location in mind, we're going to add this license key to our project manager. Now we're going to jump into the IDE where I can show you just how easy it is to embed InterBase into your mobile applications. There are 2 files that you need to add to the project manager for any of the applications that you're wanting to deploy InterBase out to. So we'll go ahead and add our database license file, as well as the license key that we unzipped earlier. reg_IBLite. Now I've added both my license keys. In the deployment manager, I'll be able to go through and click on featured files. Now, by expanding out all my options, I can see which license files that I'm going to deploy with any of my applications. In this case, I'll only be using the IBLite license file, so I won't be needing reg_IB to go. And I'm also going to deploy with some additional configuration files as well. It's that easy to add a secure database in your applications with InterBase. When you go ahead and deploy your application, the InterBase database will be deployed right along with it, and it'll only be accessible through the application and user. Now you can see here that my IB reg text file as well as the database file have now been included and can be found in my assets and internal file path for Android. I'll go ahead and pass the mic back to Craig, who will show us the CRUD operations.
So now we're going to take a look at how those methods actually function. And all of these methods have been put into the field logger data unit here. So let's take a look at this unit. Well, the first thing we have, I've got everything sort of collapsed into regions here to separate it off. But the first thing we have is tProject, which is effectively a representation of what a project will look like in the database. So it's a title and a description with a primary key called ID. Now I've set this to a uint32, an unsigned int, because in the database our IDs start at number 1 and increment up. We'll never have a negative value. And the code which causes that to increment starts at 0, which means that we'll never have a 0 entry. It'll automatically increment to 1 for the first project that we add. And that's useful to us later on because the 0 value can therefore be used to indicate that I don't know what ID I'm specifying in a method call, and we'll see that later. Immediately after, I have an array of projects. So some of the methods that we're going to call will return data in arrays. And so we'll use an array of projects to receive that data. And some of the methods also will update or delete data based on their IDs. So I have an array of uint32 here to carry an array of IDs into the method. So let's look at the methods that we have, and these are the basic 4 CRUD methods: create, read, update, and delete. So I'll quickly loop through what each of them does. The create project is going to take a project record and insert it into the database. It'll ignore the ID parameter because an ID will be generated for us by the database, and that ID will be returned as the return parameter to the core. We have the read method, which is going to read a number of projects out of the database. Now, if we specify an ID as a second optional parameter, we can specify which project we want to read, and we'll get one result matching that ID. If we leave this defaulted to 0, then it's going to look up all projects in the database for us. So that ID of 0 effectively says get everything. The update method, well, this is where we pass in an array of project objects. The IDs are going to be used to look up the record to alter, and then the title and description will be adjusted as per what's in the records in the array. We'll get a Boolean true if this succeeds in updating. If an update fails for some reason, violation of a constraint on the database or an invalid character or something like that, then we'll get a false return value, and none of the projects in the array will be inserted into the database or updated in the database. And then we have the delete method, which again, it's going to take an array, but this time it's an array of IDs. So these are the IDs of the entries that we want to delete. And again, it'll return true if that is successful. If any one of these items cannot be deleted, for whatever reason, again, if it violates a constraint or perhaps an invalid ID, then the method will fail and none of the records will actually be deleted. So we'll just cancel the whole transaction. The next thing I have is the log data structure. So we have here a vector, which is just an XYZ value that we're using for some of the log entry fields. And then I have this log entry record. Now I'm going to come back to the image data item in a moment, but effectively we have the ID of the log entry, the ID of the project to which this log entry belongs, the latitude, the longitude, and we also have our date timestamp. We then have origin, heading, acceleration, angle, distance, motion speed, and note. Currently, none of these fields are actually used in the application, but these are in the database for fields that are yet to be added to our application. So that's why those fields are there. But the first few fields here, these are essentially the fields that we're storing in the database. The one that is missing is the image. When we take a picture with the app, that gets stored in the database too. And this image data array is here to store the image data. Now I could have used something like a t-bitmap or some other kind of image class, but because I'm working with records here and we don't have any reference counting on these objects, I'm essentially creating this array because it is automatically disposed. So I'm using an array of uint8, which is effectively byte, and that's what's going to store the data which I'll stream in from a t-bitmap class. And that's what these two methods are. So if I call getPicture, a new t-bitmap will be created and it will be populated with data from our image array. And if I call setPicture, I pass in a bitmap and the image data array will be set to whatever that data is. So that allows me to access the picture to set and retrieve from the database. Again, we've got an array of log entries, and then we're onto the iLogData interface. And this is going to have the same four CRUD methods: create, read, update, and delete. Now these are going to perform in more or less the same way, with one exception. The read method here, when we specify an ID, we're not specifying the log entry ID, but instead we're specifying the project ID. And the reason I did that is just because it was convenient in this one particular app. On a typical standard CRUD interface, you would not do this. You would have the ID of the log entry in here, and when you do a read on the projects, you could also get the log entry IDs or something like that. But I decided to go ahead and just put the project ID in here. So if we call read with a project ID, we will get all entries belonging to that project. If we call read without a project ID, so we leave that set 0, then we'll get all log entries from the database. I don't need to specify a log ID to do that. Okay, and the rest of the methods remain pretty much exactly the same as they were for the project data. So let's take a quick look at these items again. If I take a look here, we have iProject data and iLog data. So these two interfaces represent my CRUD access to the database. And for that reason, I created these factory classes, tProjectData and tLogData. So these are actually records with a create function, which is a static create function, and each of them will create an appropriate implementation for the interface, iProjectData or iLogData. The advantage of creating this factory record here is if anything goes wrong during the creation of our project data implementation, we can return nil from this function to give an indication back to the caller that something went wrong. Whereas if we were to use a constructor and directly construct the class, then if something goes wrong, we'd want to raise an exception or find some other mechanism for reporting the error state. But in this case, we can just return nil to say that something went wrong. It's a simple way of mitigating raising exceptions and that kind of thing. So that's what I've done here. And if we go and take a look in, they're both pretty much the same method. Let's go and take a look at the project data create function here. So it's going to call out to fieldlogger.projectdata.standard. That's this unit right here, to get the standard implementation tProjectData and return that. That's a standard implementation of iProjectData, and return that assuming we pass in a connection, and the connection that we pass in is determined by the constructor to be valid. So what I'm doing here is I'm passing in a Boolean valid connection, and if this connection is valid, that means we can connect to the database using this connection. Valid connection will be set true, otherwise it will be set false. And here, if it is set false, we'll return nil. So that's what I was talking about before. We can return nil from the create constructor. Okay, so I've done pretty much the same thing for the tLogData create method. Here we've got the tLog entry getPicture and setPicture methods. They're very straightforward. They're effectively saving the bitmap data into a memory stream, and then using save to stream and load from stream to work with that data. And here is our log data create. So this is doing the same thing, except we're accessing a different unit, field logger log data standard. So that provides the standard implementation tlog data. And again, we're passing in a connection, getting a valid connection parameter back. And if the connection is not valid, we return nil. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the implementation of each of these. If I look at project data first, the more straightforward of them, we have the implementation of our create project, read, update, and delete. Let's go and take a look at create project. We pass in a tproject record, and what we're going to do is create a FireDAC query. We're going to connect the FireDAC query to the connection which we actually have stored. So let me go and show you that actually. So here's our constructor. We're going to store the connection in this private member F connection, and then we're going to attempt to activate that connection to see if it is valid and return our valid status. But if our status is valid, then we still have this F connection reference and can use it within our code. So let's go back to our create project. We are setting the F connection here into the query. So the query is now connected to our database. We're then going to set the SQL statement. Now, in most cases, for a CRUD create method, you would want to use the insert statement and pass in the parameters for the insert. I've done a little bit of a trick here. I'm actually using select star from projects because we have a relatively small database. I'm just going to select everything from the projects table. I'm going to activate that query, and then I'm going to call the append method to add a new record on the end. Now, the reason that I've done this is it's a little easier if using append to get back the project ID. If we do an insert, I'm not certain, it depends on the database engine, but I'm not certain that it would end, the record would end up on the end of our table. It could be inserted into a free record somewhere in the middle of the table. And so by using the append method, we guarantee that it's on the last record. And then we insert our fields, the project ID. I'll come back to why that's set as 0 in just a moment. The project title being the title of our project, the description of our project, and then I call the post method, which is going to send those changes to the database. I'm then going to refresh the query, which will again execute this select star. So this is not an efficient method. It'll scroll to the last item in the result set, and then it's going to query the project ID field to find out what is the ID of the project we just created. As I've said, this one method here is not the most efficient way of doing things, and in a multi-user environment could be concerning, but we're actually talking about an embedded database on a phone here, so I'm less concerned with that. The data is small, and this is more convenient to use. And here's why. With the InterBase database, we pass in a project ID of 0, and a trigger on the database is going to be executed and populate the project ID field for us. Now, there is no such thing as an auto increment field in the InterBase database. Instead, a trigger is used with a number generator to generate the number. And so when we push this record in, because project ID or proj ID is a primary key, the database engine will complain if it hasn't been set to a value, but at the same time, it's going to immediately overwrite the value that we send with the auto-generated value. So we pass in a value of 0 here because 0 is an invalid ID. All IDs start from 1 on the auto-generator, and allow the engine to overwrite that with whatever project ID that we want to get. And then we're going to refresh it, and this is how we get our project ID back. When we do the refresh, we are submitting that query again, and so whatever the trigger generated for our project ID is what we're going to get back. Okay, and then we dispose of our query, and everything went well and we're happy. You'll notice that I'm returning the ID of the item we generated. So let's go and take a look at our read method. Now, in the read method, we could get multiple results come out in this array, depending on what we pass in as our ID. So let's take a look at how we handle that. So we're going to create one of two SQL statements. If we pass in an ID of 0, knowing that this cannot be a valid ID for the database, then we're saying we want to select everything. So we're doing a select star from the projects table. If, on the other hand, we pass in an ID, then we're saying we want to specify a particular project. So we'll do select star from projects where the proj ID field matches the ID parameter that we're going to set. And we immediately set that ID parameter here to the ID that we pass in as a parameter. We'll then attempt to activate the query, and if the query has a record count of 0, we know that nothing has been returned and we exit. Otherwise, we're going to set the projects array, so that's our array parameter here. We're going to set that array length to the number of records which were found in the database. We're going to start an index counter at 0, set the query to the first record, and while we're not on EOF, so end of file means the last entry in the database, while we're not on EOF, we're going to set the entry in our array index of 0 to the ID of the project. Again, set the title to the title of the project and the description to the description of the project. And then we're going to increment our IDX, so we're accessing the next item in the array, and we'll call query.next, so we're accessing the next record in the database. And in this way, we're going to copy out all of the entries that we discover into our array. And then as a result, we return the number of entries that we actually got back from the database. So we'll have an indication of how many items are in the array, and that should match the length of the array if we test it. Okay, so that's our read method. Update's a little different. So we're going to pass in several projects here, and we want to update each of them. They each have to have a valid project ID so that we can find the record to update. And because any one of the items in this array could fail, we're actually going to start a transaction here. So what the transaction is going to let us do is, if something goes wrong during the execution of any one of these updates, we can hit transaction.rollback, and it will roll back the database to the condition it was in before we started executing updates. On the other hand, if we execute the updates and they all pass, then we just hit transaction commit, and all of those changes are applied at once to the database. Otherwise, this is pretty much the same as the other methods we've looked at. We have an update statement here which takes in parameters of project title, project description, and ID. We set them to the values in our array objects and execute the SQL. Now, because we're injecting or updating records here, we use query.exec SQL because we don't expect a resulting data set to come back. Okay, and that's more or less everything else is the same as the methods we've looked at. Let's go and take a look at delete. Now, delete is again using a transaction. So if we fail to delete any of the items from the database, then we will roll back this transaction. It'll be as though nothing happened. But effectively, we're just going to execute this delete statement against the IDs which we're getting from our projects array here. And the projects array is just an array of uint32, so an array of IDs. So very straightforward, create, update, create, read, update, and delete CRUD methods there. Let's go and take a look at log data real quick. Now, log data is pretty much the same thing. So we have our create, read, update, and delete methods. They all work in more or less the same way, the difference being we have a lot more fields that we can insert. So that's really the only difference between the log data and the project data, with the exception of the picture or image field. So the picture field right here. Effectively, this is a blob field. Blob is, I think, binary large object or something like that. It's effectively a binary data field in the database. And we can cast our field here as a tblob field and load it from a stream. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a memory stream, so a temporary stream, and I'm also going to create a bitmap by calling getPicture from our entry. So that's going to call that getPicture method that's going to read out the image data, and it'll create a bitmap. I'm going to save that bitmap into the memory stream, and then I'm going to reset the position of the memory stream to 0. No longer need the bitmap because the memory stream now contains our data, and then I do load from stream to load that data into the database. Immediately after that, I will call post, which is going to post that change up to the database. And then again, I'm doing refresh, go to the last record and find the log ID. So our create entry is still going to return a log ID. The one method that is different here is read. You'll remember I put in project ID instead of a log ID. And so when we create the select statements here, I'm saying we either select all from log entries if our project ID is 0, or we select log entries with a matching project ID. So that's our foreign key onto the projects table. And so in doing it this way, we can read out all log entries pertaining to a particular project, or all log entries in the database. We're not going to read out a single log entry by itself by ID. So that's how we handle the data access CRUD methods in our application.
Great, Craig. Thanks for that. I'm going to finish up with the reporting element. And as a lot of things I try to do, it got a little complicated. So I'm going to move through it quickly, but I'll make sure all the information is available for you to refer back to. So the pieces that were involved in here, I had to work with Android permissions to save files, which also required for like pictures and stuff like that. Also resizing the images because we don't want to embed huge images. And then we're going to embed images in HTML so we have a single file for sharing. Build it and display it, share it via email, and that requires on Android working with the FileProvider. So why were we doing HTML reporting? Well, we're building this training and we wanted to have a single file that we could share that had images and text in it. Now, Share Sheet makes it easy to share just text or images or both, a bit of text and an image, but not a combination, right? Something that's more complex. And so that's where the idea came up with to use HTML with embedded images. Now, in the real world, you're probably going to use a PDF generator, which is a lot of great options from tech partners, but we wanted something that didn't require any third-party component. To embed an image in HTML, we use what's called the data URI scheme. It's right here. You just, here's an example of it. Right here, we're embedding a PNG base64, and there's the base64 embedded PNG. Keep in mind, it's going to add a third, again, to the size of the image to embed it in the HTML with base64. Images were bigger than HTML to begin with, so watch out, your HTML file could really balloon doing this. Here's some example code. We're using net encoding. Going to put it into a stream, put the stream into a byte array, and then right here encode bytes to string. If you're putting in either HTML in your HTML, make sure you use HTML encoding though, so you don't get rogue greater than symbols, less than symbols. Here's a routine for resizing a JPEG. So if the JPEGs you have in your database are really large, you're going to want to use this to shrink them down to a viewable size before embedding them. Otherwise, your HTML file is going to be way too big. Using create blob stream to read it out of the field, put it into a JPEG, check the width, resize it, and then here's some math to make sure that we maintain our aspect ratio. Now, before we can save the file, we need to understand Android's new permission model. This was introduced in Marshmallow. You need to ask for permissions to do things before writing to external storage, accessing location, accessing camera, etc. There's information in the doc wiki, and then Brian Long has a fantastic article on it as well. So this is the code I have, and originally I was going to save it outside of my cache path, which is where it's being saved now, which is why I introduced this permissions. And then I realized just now that I don't need the permission request because cache path is an internal inside my application folder. But that's okay. This is useful reference for you anyway. So we request permission, write external storage. If it's granted, then right here we set granted results, granted, then we're able to write it. Now, I'm using conditional define so that I only check this on Android. Now you can call permission services on other platforms and it will always return true if there's no permission manager. But this Java class code here that we use to get to the string for that is Android specific. So anyway, that's what the conditional defines are there for. Now the create email is going to call a routine to create an email and send with this attachment. In order for the email program to be able to read the file that you've saved, you have to use Android file providers. Now, this requires you modify your Android manifest.template.xml file and add this block of code in here. You can use this code verbatim. It pulls the package name from the template expansion automatically. It does reference this FileProvider path XML file, which is right here. This is what you might want to change. This is just the names of the folders you're going to save it to. We're using the cache path right here, and we're sharing it as report. So this is the name of what you're sharing it as, and this is the path where it's at within cache path. So this means root of cache path is called reports, and I can share files from there. Also here, this is sharing it from your files path, which is your documents path, and we're calling it shared, and it's a path of shared inside the files path. You can find more information about it here in the documentation in the Android documentation. Also, this FileProvider path.xml file needs to be deployed in res/xml. This is the code I got from Brian Long. Actually, he originally wrote it for XE6, and then Remy commented on it about how to add attachments, and then I modified it to work with Rio. Lots of Android API calls. This is one thing I love about working with FireMonkey is you can do so much stuff just FireMonkey level, right, with cross-platform. But then when you need to reach down and grab these Java APIs, this is pretty much a literal translation of what it would look like if it was written in Java, except it's Pascal syntax, which is easier on my eyes. Right here's where we check to see if it's an attachment, and we get the attachment, and then we are using this routine here. This is something that changed in order to deal with the file provider, the JFile to JURI, and this is going to create a JURI that's appropriate for where we saved it at. So we need to make sure we saved it into a path that was defined in those paths we had listed. Now on iOS, you're going to use a different routine, and luckily Roy Wall of Wall-to-Wall Software has a library you can take a look at there. I'm not going to demo that for you, but you can go out and grab that and send attachments with that. Here's a quick sample of this running on my phone. You see here it is, the app. I have a list view here where you can see the different items, the different entries. And then when I tap on the reports tab, it generates the HTML report with all of the data here with the images and the data for the individual items. I tap the pencil. This brings up the sharing to email, where I can now provide an email address of who I want to send it to. I'll send it to myself. And I can also edit the subject and body, etc. You'll see that my report.html file is attached there in the middle. Now I could have attached multiple files to this, I guess, essentially, but that would have been not an ideal solution. I have a third tab here where you can see this is what the HTML looks like in there, just kind of for interesting information. In my inbox, you see the email arrives with the attachment, just like I would get any other email with an attachment. In this case, it happens to be an HTML document. I can then open it up with any modern browser, just anything but Internet Explorer, I'm assuming, and there's all the images embedded in HTML. And if I inspect it, you can see here the image is actually embedded in there as data. And now I'll turn it back over to Mary Kelly for a wrap-up before we go to our live Q&A.
There are several resources available to you for setting up and building mobile applications. We have our DocWiki site, the Embarcadero YouTube channel, and application samples that demonstrate several mobile app features. We've also provided you with the link to the application code that was used for this webinar. Thanks again for watching our webinar on mobile application development. If you have any questions, please reach out to us again at our first.lastname at embarcadero.com with any questions. Otherwise, on to the Q&A.
All right, everyone, at this point, let's move on to the Q&A. We have our presenters online. Jim, do you want to follow up with anything right after that video?
So questions, I am putting up the blog post with some of the source code and the replays and stuff like that. It'll be available on community.embarcadero.com shortly. Was in the middle of that. It's almost done, but not quite done. So there's a question to be here about why not using live bindings. Originally, we'd used live bindings, and we thought that we would just show the mechanism of using the object wrappers as a way of doing it differently. I don't know if Craig or Al, if you want to add something to that.
All right, yeah. So originally we did do live bindings. It was the quickest way to prototype the app. But then there was some sort of consensus between us that we wanted to look at object relational mapping type of system with CRUD, and so it was redone for that reason. So yeah, you could do it either way. It's just nice to separate the logic from the UI when you do it as object relational system.
Yeah, it basically gives you the ability to have a little bit more flexibility, I suppose. But you certainly could use live bindings. It really depends on this application. Like Craig said, we originally used live bindings. It could use the live bindings, but we did it this way so that you'd have something maybe more flexible that something you could do more flexible with for other implementations. Transition effects, that was using the tab control action with transition property. There's code in there which we'll have listed and available for you. The example code.
Correct. So yeah, when you saw that home screen form change to the login form, those forms were tabs, and as Jim mentioned, those forms were tabs, and the FireMonkey tabs have a change tab action that supports either a slide animation or no animation to indicate a transition between the pages or the tabs. So you can control how you want to transition between forms or tabs by using this tab control action.
So question here, if an APK is minimized while running a query, will that still work for a while? Technically, yes, it will still work. The OS can, so on Android, the OS can close your application at any time. And so your application needs to know that and needs to respond to that. So there are a number of events your application receives, for example, letting it know, hey, you've been minimized. Now, if you don't respond to that event and you keep running full bore in the background, you can do that. But once you've received that notification, whether you responded to it or not, the application may then decide, or the OS may then decide to close your application in the middle of the query. So you need to handle those application events and respond to those and make sure that your application is able to behave appropriately, especially in the background. If it's like running in the background full bore, the OS, most modern OSs will say, hey, this app is running in the background and using a lot of battery and using a lot of data. You want to do something about that, and then people will close it down. Let's see here. Suggested saying that you should call commit after rollback, create without. I'm not sure I understand the comment there.
Yeah, fair. But so it's with the transactions code, calling a rollback. Yes, you may be right that I should call commit after rollback. I thought that was a BDE thing, but I might be wrong. So yeah, maybe I need to go in and add that line, but tested and it works. So yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the tricky things with doing something like this is frequently we're trying, like I said, originally this was in live bindings, and we said, well, let's make it a little more robust. And one of the problems in creating demos and samples like this is finding that balance between simple and best practices and such. So it's not always perfect when we try and get more complicated for sure, but there's always a better way to do things, it seems like. Multiple forms from templates in your application, are they separate forms or somehow inside the tabs of one form? So right now it's all one form, and what we see as a screen is just on a tab. Now I think at least in my opinion, a better way, a more modular way of doing it is to have what's the contents of the tab in a frame and then embed the frames in the tabs. But for this application, it's all on one form on tab controls. You can also do it in multiple forms, and you can embed a form on a tab control, or you can just switch between forms. So there's different ways of handling it. I don't know, Craig, do you want to comment on what your thoughts are on the best way of handling that, or why you went a specific direction on that?
Yeah, it was really about because this is such a small app. The way that we had it set up initially was forms and frames. So for every one of those tabs was a form and a frame. And I know that it introduces a little bit of a performance hit to pile everything into one form. But after doing the conversion from live bindings, excuse me, that's my son. After doing the conversion from live bindings, I found that actually the code in the form itself was pretty light, and so it was easier to manage if I just put it all in, all in the same tabs. And also you get that cool little transition effect. So I wanted to get that in there as well.
Transitions on Android don't work? That's odd. Pretty sure I have the app installed on my phone right now. Let me run it and see. I thought it was working. Where is this change tab action? I'm looking at the object inspector and I see nothing like that.
Yeah, it was an option on the in code. So in the on change, in a button click event, if you tell the tab control to, there's a method for change tabs. I need to open up my IDE to find it, but there's a method there and it has an enum to select the transition.
That's correct. On the button click, one of the new standard actions for tab is a change tab action.
So I just tested the app on my phone and I did not see any transitions. Hello, this is Jim from the future. I went back and tested this and did some research. Turns out you need to use the set active tab with transition async method. If you use the non-async version on Android, you will have no transitions. But because of the way the UI threading is handled on Android, you have to use the async call on Android if you want to have the transition animation. So if you encounter a bug, and I feel like I repeat this a lot, but if you do encounter a bug or some unexpected behavior, please report it at quality.embarcadero.com. Product management and R&D reviews those frequently, I think weekly, and that's how they're able to fix things. And not always, they don't always have visibility to everything that's going on. They don't run every application all the time. So if you do see something that isn't working or not working the way you expect it, please report it so that it can be fixed. Embed frames or use layout and switch parent from form to the main form. Usually, I would say embed frames. I don't know if Al, do you have a different opinion on that? Embedding frames versus changing the parents to which one?
Well, either one will work. So you do have a few options on how you want to navigate between these forms. So either using embedded frames or the tabs, or hiding one form and showing another form, or valid techniques on how you can navigate between forms for a FireMonkey multi-device application.
Yeah, and that's I hate one thing about best practices or what's the best way to do it is there's pros and cons, and you kind of need to test it in the way you're doing it and see which way works best for you. There's always lots of options, and you need to just kind of test it and see what works best for you. Why do you always use field find name of or anything like this? Isn't this type secure? I always field editor create fixed fields. So that's a really good question. I remember in my development, I originally started out using the fixed fields where it just added the fields. And then I was working on one project where the way the queries came back, you're less likely to get, sometimes it changes, right? So there was a middle tier, and sometimes the middle tier would change the code you'd get back. And so they didn't always have a fixed number of fields you'd get. So it was kind of a little weird, but so we were using the field by name. But the problem with field by name, especially let's say you have a loop where you're going through multiple records, right? So you're while not end of file and you're going through all those fields, is that each time you do field by name, it does a loop internally and scans through all those. So you're going to want to grab those indexes of those fields and do it by index instead of by name ahead of time to improve performance. Now, in one of the other issues about using field by name previously, fixed name fields was previously, is that if you had some that changed and you were adding and removing them. You had to go through to remove all the fields and re-add them again. And that was actually fixed as a new feature in, I want to say, Seattle. So they're actually, I personally use the fixed fields with the field editor and create fixed fields most all the time because it is more flexible now and fixes all the problems that I used field by name previously. So again, there are pros and cons to each. Like I said, they did improve and fix a lot of those things, I think, in Seattle. So there were, test it and find what works best for you. Just be aware of the way it works and the pros and cons of each. Please give a quick overview of what I need to deploy to both Google Play Store and Apple's App Store. There's a good overview of that in the doc wiki. If you go to docwiki.embarcadero.com, there is some documentations on that, or docs on that. Let's see if I can find the link for it real quick. That kind of walks you through the steps for mobile development.
Jim, I just went ahead and added that link for the Android development to the question.
Yes, yeah. So great, thank you.
Anytime.
Where can I get instructions on how to debug on my phone through USB? I believe that's also on there. There is one note about debugging is there is a bug in Android 8 that prevents debugging on an Android 8 device. 8.1, they fixed it. It was like it came out and, nobody could debug. And it wasn't a Delphi specific feature. It was an Android specific feature. And they released it. Now, apparently, Samsung never updated their 8.0 devices to 8.1. They're still on 8. So if you're stuck with an 8.0 device, you can't debug, unfortunately. But otherwise, there's good information in the doc wiki. Here's the link for sending to the iOS store. That's what I can find. So as far as for debugging via USB, it depends. Android versus iOS, there's different instructions, but you would need to follow the guide for setting up your device for Android development versus iOS development. So here is the guide for iOS development. Then there is the, I think that link, you can follow that one. That links to the guide for US or Android development. So it's going to be different for Android versus iOS. David commented that Craig said that you couldn't get location information on Windows. It depends. If the Windows, so the location component will support all the platforms. But if the OS either has, there's a permission you can set to whether or not your OS can report location information to your applications, and also whether or not you have that functionality enabled. So I think you either have to have a GPS chip or be on Wi-Fi on Windows, I think. I'm not positive. But there are specific requirements for each platform. So if you get no location information back, either most likely scenario, your OS is set to not report that. Or if your OS is set to report that, then it's possible you don't have the correct hardware to report it correctly.
Yeah, so I can add to that if you don't have a GPS sensor on your Windows device, which of course you do on some, so things like the Surface and what have you might have a GPS in them. But on my desktop, I don't have a GPS. Windows can do a kind of general location based on your IP, but it's an option that you turn on or off, and it's typically set during installation. And so during installation, I've actually turned that option off. So I don't have that API, or I have the API, but it doesn't. It's not usable.
So there's a comment here by Pablo saying the size of programs generated with Delphi is too big, and I understand if you're frustrated by that, Pablo. This is a pet peeve of mine. If you look at apps in the App Store, a Delphi generated app versus an app generated with any other development tool are roughly the same size for the same type of application. Now, if you build a Hello World in Android Studio versus Hello World in Delphi, yes, the Delphi app will be bigger, but it's not in real world applications, real world scenarios, the applications, if they are bigger, they're not much bigger, and the size of the application has absolutely minimal impact in 90% of the situations for that. Now, occasionally you do want a very, very small application. Fine. Doesn't have to be the best tool for every situation, but it's the best tool for most situations. So there is I can send you a link here. FMS Express has a anatomy of FireMonkey applications diagram they put together, and it shows all the stuff that's included in a FireMonkey application as opposed to when you're building for different platforms. And one of the things is that when you build a Hello World for other applications, they don't include by default the Android support library. So in Android support library, lets your application target more versions of the Android platform. If you don't include that, then you're only going to be able to work on a very few of those. So by including that library, that makes your application bigger. So when you're building a Delphi application, you have this large framework of functionality that you're getting for free that's included in that. Now you can strip some of that out if you want to and make your application smaller if that's your goal. But then once you go to do something with it, you got to add all that back in. So again, if you're building a real application, the size is not that big of a difference and is not a big deal. Let's see. I use DevX and Report Builder. Can these or other third-party components leveraged if they make FXMX controls? I believe Report Builder has some FireMonkey functionality. I know DevExpress keeps saying they're working on some FireMonkey components, but I can't remember if those are done or not at this point, or where they're at with that. If they do have FireMonkey support, and they do have, so there's FireMonkey support and there's mobile support both. So, Craig pointed out TMS has a lot of great FireMonkey mobile controls as well. So there's lots of controls out there for FireMonkey and mobile, but I'm not sure if DevExpress specifically does. So it needs to be support. So depending on the control, if it's FireMonkey, it will probably work on mobile, but some controls still make calls to Windows APIs, even if they are FireMonkey. So it needs to be both FireMonkey compatible and mobile compatible. TMS is a fantastic resource for that. Glad you could join us, Scott, Michigan Delphi guy. Let's see. And I think that's it. I think we've gotten through the questions. So anything anybody wants to add before we go? We'll start with Al. Anything you want to add before we go, Al? If there's a question I missed that you saw in the log.
Nope. Looks like you covered it all, Jim. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Craig, anything you want to add?
As you mentioned, the link will include the sample app we built and the slides and maybe some lab exercises to actually create the application.
Yes. Yep. This is all based off of a training we put together. It's still a bit in progress, but there will be more resources and more to come for that. Craig, anything you want to add real quick before we go?
Nothing other than happy birthday, Delphi, tomorrow, and happy Valentine's Day to everyone.
Yes, absolutely. Mary Kelly.
There's nothing much. Well, with InterBase, the IBLite version that we've been using, it does not actually support encryption. So if you do need an encrypted database, you'll need to go up to the InterBase to go version, not the IBLite that's already provided to you.
That is true. Yeah.
But IB to go is an Enterprise and Architect editions.
Yes. So as long as you have an Enterprise or Architect edition, you at least can get the test deployment and such for that.
Well, I think
Awesome.
you get the test deployment in Pro, and then don't we include a license in Enterprise and Architect?
Yes, but if you're wanting to distribute an application, then you need to contact us for more licenses.
Oh, right.
So,
yeah, for distributing it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm not the salesperson. I don't understand the licensing stuff. Okay, fantastic. Great. I think we're going to go ahead and go. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and we will talk to y'all later. Good luck in your application development.